Yeah, I would love one. Okay, so the question then is, if I were to rephrase it or just paraphrase it, is like what stands out about Leary's ideas in 2024?
Yeah, yeah, let's start. I have a kind of a progression leading up to that.
Okay,
I
okay.
would, the kind of the first thing that I thought was helpful was in your recent interview on the Hilaritas podcast and in this, platypus gets an MRI thing. Um, like how you described the circuits as developmental stages. And I found
Right.
that really fascinating because now it takes something that was just kind of like a placeholder concept like circuits, and it gives it shape and it explains, kind of the reality of how circuits might work or how these stages might work.
Right.
So maybe we could start there.
Okay, yeah. So the way I look at it is that the first four circuits represent states of consciousness or dimensions of self or whatever you want to mind, dimensions of mind that are best represented as stages of development. And I guess what I'm saying is I like to focus on the infant, the toddler, the preschooler, and the adolescent. And I think that though if you look at those developmental stages, they represent states of consciousness within us,
Mhm.
and they're always running. And and so then it becomes like which well, if we look at infant consciousness, how does that inform uh, today?
Mhm.
And so Leary and Wilson kind of focused on safety and security, and I think that's the gist if you were to say it in one word. But if you start looking at infant and what they're doing, they eat, poop, sleep, and they want to be nurtured and held, and they want to feel like it's safe in the world, and
Mhm.
they know it's safe if they feel held by somebody that feels safe, for example. And so there's a part of us that's always asking, is the world okay? Is the world safe? Um, and that's circuit one in a nutshell. And so what I wanted to do is really dig into what we know about those states of development today with modern stuff, and how that can inform how we would define these. Uh, and the major shift I think that I'm trying to bring is that Leary and Wilson kind of grew up in the age of behavioralism and individualism and just cry it out and you do it on your own. And it's really what we're seeing is that this is a deeply relational thing. And so it's like the infant's relationship to the caregiver and to the world, and what does that look like? And so that's where I'm trying to tease out and look at these in a more
Mhm.
nuanced or fresh way, I guess you would say.
Yeah, I find it really interesting that you talk about you know, different modalities, I guess, of developmental psychology, different basically these different charts that people like Erickson and Piaget
Yeah,
came up with, and how they all seem to more or less correspond to each other and more or less correspond to Leary's four circuits.
yes. And Young as well,
And
I
Jung,
was
yeah.
excited to find. Um, so I guess uh, I would say that to me, I think it was Freud. I think
Mhm.
Leary, you can see he wrote an essay, Seven Tongues of God,
Mhm.
when he was in Millbrook.
Yeah.
And he really wasn't on the Freud perspective at that time. He was kind of more on the here's different substances and how they affect our behavior. And maybe
Mhm.
that's how we can group all this out. Because, like alcohol, and speed were in the lower circuits, things like
Yeah.
that. But by the time he wrote info or exo, what was exo psychology, to me that just screams Freud.
Mhm.
And and that was the oral, anal, sexual, or phallic, latent, and
Mhm.
sexual were his stages. And I think Erickson came along, and he was just Freud had his psychosexual lens. It's like we want to take Freud seriously, but not too seriously. I think the bias Freud had was that sexual lens, which makes sense coming out of the Victorian era. That's just what was going on in the world. And he's like, here's where the repression is. We put fucking tablecloths over, to hide table legs because they're too sexy.
Right.
So Freud had that lens, and Erickson came along, and he was definitely influenced by Freud. I don't know offhand what their relationship was, if anything, but he had a psychosocial lens, and he took those stages out to later life, when you start worrying about what's my legacy as I'm getting ready to pass on, which is so fun. I mean, it's true from what I've seen. It's something that starts to come up in my 50s already. But so there was that lens. And most of what I've read about Jung doesn't really go into that. But there was this book that actually Jordan Peterson, of all people, recommended. It's Eric Neumann, and I forget the detail, the history of consciousness or something more. And I read that book a few years ago, and it was, first of all, Jung says right off the bat as the introduction, like, the pioneer can't summarize his work because he's too busy pioneering. But this is a summary of my work. And it outlines basically 4 stages of consciousness, and by looking at the development of myth. Like, here's early myth is kind of circuit 1, and then myth kind of evolved into circuit 2, and then 3 and 4 using circuit language. But it was these 4 stages that fit right in with the circuits. And the second half of the book is, if we look at child development, it does these same 4 stages. And that's when that was for me, when I got that, I was like, oh shit, and it felt like I was onto something legit.
Yeah.
And it just doubled my conviction on the model. And that's really, you take Freud had 5 stages, but there was a latency stage that goes from like 6 years old to puberty. And he called it latency. And it's because there's not much happening. Yes, there are things happening, but it's like there's not a neurodevelopmental thing going on. And so it's like when our brain is not fully developed, it's developing through these first 5 years in the womb, and then again in adolescence. And that's, to me, when it's taking on imprints and creating these states of mind, or whatever we want to call them. So I guess, that's the quick rundown on. You can look at Piaget, and he did developmental stages, and he's probably the most legitimate. It's very scientific, rigorous the way he did it. But if you look at it, he, in my opinion, he kind of lumps 1 and 2 together, and just kind of the sensory motor, and then he goes on. So, but it's kind of the same zones he's looking at.
So, what then, without the, when you read, like, go back to the earliest stuff, so neurologic, or, early stuff that Wilson wrote, you get a sense of circuits and imprinting as, like, the strictly, like I said in my email, it's like a switch, it's like you're in the zone, and then, you encounter something like you encounter something in your environment, and all of a sudden you're imprinted, you have an imprint. But what is kind of the understanding of the 4 kind of
So if you read Prometheus Rising, it's like you take an imprint at birth, you take an imprint when you start walking, you take an imprint when you have your first orgasm. And it's like, I imagine those are very powerful experiences, but it's not. Well, so to get into what I understand it to be, the way I see it now, it's an epigenetic imprint. So let's take the amygdala. I don't want to say the amygdala is the first circuit, but as far as like a neurologic structure, it's probably the most 1-to-1 correlation with the first circuit, or with a circuit. And the amygdala actually, so these neurological structures, they develop, and then all of a sudden they're fully developed, and it's like they turn on. And there's a phrase for this, and it's escaping me at the moment. Critical window of activation. So imagine the amygdala is suddenly fully developed, and it turns on, and so it is then receiving the environmental signals to make an epigenetic imprint. there's a very short window for that for the amygdala, for example, and it takes on that imprint based on its environment at that time, and then that's that. So for the amygdala in my example here, that actually happens in the womb. And then the rest of the limbic system goes through its thing kind of in the third trimester all the way up through about 3 or 4 years old. And then in adolescence, you kind of have some of the growth and development in the prefrontal cortex, but also the entire brain structure changes. And that it was originally just a huge mass of I'm going to just call it tentacles from the neuron, right? They're just everywhere. It's just, and whatever you're actually using kind of gets wired up. And then we go through this pruning phase in adolescence where the circuits, the neural connections that are not used just kind of lop off and die away. But at the same time, what is being used is literally like a wire. It's like they're all bare copper wires and they get insulated. Mm-hmm. So then in my mind, it's like, well, how does that inform what's happening in adolescence? And that's another story. But just in terms of that takes place from, say, the beginning of puberty and ends at the age of 25. Mm-hmm. So you're talking an imprint window of a decade or more versus the amygdala, which is, a heartbeat, well, more than a heartbeat, but a small window in the womb. So I think in the big picture, it's starting to study epigenetics and how that imprint is taken, but also how can we reprogram our epigenetic imprint. And to explain that a little bit, it's basically you have thousands of genes, and the epigenetic imprint determines whether that gene is switched on or off. Mm-hmm. And so the sense of it is, maybe one way to say is we have all this genetic potential, but some of it is epigenetically switched off. Mm-hmm. And then it's like, how could we open up all of our genes to be fully expressed? That could be like in one way of thinking about spiritual development. It's opening up our genes and fully expressing who we are. And I don't know if there's much science on re-imprinting right now, right. But you can look at, where real change happens through psychotherapy or re-imprinting through trauma, and childbirth is definitely one that Leary mentioned that definitely changes. There's something shifts. There's all kinds of hormonal changes in both the parents. I've gone on for a while, so I'm going to pause and let you.
Sure. So is there we have a very clear correlation between the lower four circuits and developmental stages.
Yeah.
Now, when you get to the upper four circuits and you're talking about transpersonal psychology, is there a type of correspondence between the upper circuits that you found and kind of what people are, this, study of these transpersonal states, or is that more of an intuition of Leary's?
And that's an interesting, Leary and Wilson, I think both presented these as sort of a developmental hierarchy. Like you went through 1 through 4, and then you opened up 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, and that even leads people to believe, what could circuit 9 be, and things like that. And to be honest, I had some intuition that there was these connections, and I didn't really know what to do with it until I really discovered Ontro. And it was really the time I met him or started interacting with him that he really took it from what he saw in Angel Tech to a much more robust shock and anchor model that he talks about. He developed at that time, around 2005, 6, somewhere in there, and how they relate to each other, and how the fifth circuit exposes the vulnerabilities of the first, and the solid first circuit opens up more fifth circuit potential. Mm-hmm. And I guess I take that a step further to where I see like the lower 4 is like the soul, and the upper 4 is just like emergent spiritual properties of the lower. So I'm saying that, and when I think of these circuits, to me, the developmental stages inform the lower circuits, and the lower circuits inform the upper circuits, and how
Mm-hmm.
they can be transcendental. And I guess if I'm understanding, maybe part of your question, or just another thing that comes up for me, is that if you look at like, I haven't done this rigorously, but I think if you look at Buddhist states of higher consciousness, they
Mm-hmm.
do correspond um, to some of the upper circuits, if not all of them. And so that's one way to look at it. Um, I think a lot of discussion is where you draw the lines
Yeah.
between these upper circuits, and you can even say, where do you draw the lines in the lower circuits? And it's just kind of, we're using this as a framework to try to describe something that's broad and on a spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
like all things in life, I guess. But
Okay.
and so I remember now. So I took a transpersonal class at Naropa that was a great survey of all the transpersonal stuff, or a lot of it. And a lot of it related, in my mind, to the hero's journey. And to me, that's kind of the other piece that maybe falls in here, is that we all go through this, somehow we're shaken up, and we go
Mm-hmm.
through this, start this process of waking up, so to speak. And to me, that's the hero's journey. And maybe being born is a hero's journey, and you
Mm-hmm.
can correlate Stan Grof's perinatal matrices of the process of birth to the
Yeah.
hero's journey, 1 to 1.
Yeah. Yeah.
And walking is its hero's journey, and learning to talk is a hero's journey. And then going back and waking up and integrating these phases is all kinds of hero's journeys. So when I look at like that portion of transpersonal psychology, maybe that's more of a process
Mm-hmm.
versus these states of mind, and like a transformational process. I'm trying to think, what else comes to my mind. Ken Wilber is another big one, especially where I come from in Naropa and Boulder. I don't live in Boulder, but
Mm-hmm.
he's big up there, and he had a lot of similar ideas, I would say. And there's a discussion of, maybe did, in my raw circles, did he steal from Wilson? I don't know if he did or not. He might have been inspired by some of them and taken it from a psychedelic context, mindfulness, Buddhism,
Mm-hmm.
meditation context. But there's a lot of, or I guess in general, you're talking about transpersonal. John Lilly had states of consciousness that are very similar to
Mm-hmm.
the Eighth Circuit, and you could do some mapping there, which I think just shows you can always correlate these models to the
Mm-hmm.
tree of life and the chakras, and a lot of that has been done. And to me, it's like, well, they're all models of consciousness. I used to be fascinated by that in my youth, and these correlations. And in my old age, I'm like, well, they're all different models of consciousness, so of course they're going to be similar. No shit.
Yeah.
Uh, but now it's like, I want to study this model and enjoy or appreciate what's unique about this, and the developmental piece I don't think shows up in those other models the way it does in the Eighth Circuit model.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's really, in a sense, grafting something very knowable. Like, we don't understand, you know, all the ins and outs of the brain and of developmental psychology now, but we can. The brain is a physical structure, and we have electron microscopes or whatever. But like, that grafted onto this like second layer, which it's much more subjective and fuzzy, the upper four circuits.
Yeah,
So it's just kind of like, yeah, I think a lot of people, you might have mentioned this, something I've heard of yours, but yeah, for me, I just like, my main interest was the lower four circuits for, until this year when I started this project, really, just because something you know, um, say what you will about like Leary and Wilson's bias to the upper circuits. It was kind of like the lower circuits. It was like something I could use. And,
yeah,
it wasn't until like my magical practice got to a point in the last couple years where I realized that, for all this talk of space aliens and, space migration, that, things that I began to experience could be explained by the upper eight circuits. And then, and then I find out later, going through this history of how the thinking developed, Leary was inspired by Western magic this whole time. And
Mm.
I saw this interview that Gabriel Kennedy did with Robert Anton Wilson, where Wilson said, I was reading, this medieval nonsense that Aleister Crowley was writing, trying to figure out what, like what it was all about. And then I realized that it's, the perfect way to program an acid trip. So, there's like
Leary said that.
Wilson said that.
Will, okay, yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, so that sparked my interest in the upper states and kind of like seeing where this all came from.
Yeah, I guess I would just interject that the big value to me, there's something about getting this model out there, particularly with the interest of psychedelic therapy and helping people that are having these psychedelic experiences understand what's going on,
Mm-hmm.
how that kind of maps on a bigger context, and how they can then use that understanding to better integrate the experience.
And I want to ask you, before we get too late here, I want to ask you about your practice, your Gestalt therapy, and how the 8-circuit model, how it
Yeah.
informs your work. Like, I'm really trying to make a point in this last part of my book that there is a usefulness to this stuff and people are using it. So I would ask you to describe
Okay.
your experience, and also I'll probably ask you or remind you, I'm curious other practitioners out there I might look up.
Okay. Yeah. Um, so the Gestalt therapy that the school that I was trained at, Gestalt Institute of the Rockies, the founder and guy running the show, had his own specific ideas, and he would have boiled the first 5 stages, let's say,
Mhm.
to questions. The infant is asking, "Is the world okay?" The toddler is asking, "Am I okay?" The preschooler, they don't quite. I think that Erickson and Dewey kind of miss the bigger general semantics, conceptual knowledge part of the third circuit. But anyway, so the preschooler is, let's see, how much can I do and how well can I do it? And then the adolescent is asking, who am I?
Mhm.
And so that's taught uniquely at the Gestalt Institute of the Rockies. It was taught at Naropa for a long time when he was a professor there. But basically, as a practitioner, I am watching and looking primarily at nonverbals, their tone and their energy and how they're presenting themselves, and seeing, what is the infant saying? Is this person, what's the dominant question, maybe is another way to put it, that this person is asking right now? Is it, who am I? I might look at a third circuit differently, and where is this person stuck in their beliefs, but also am I okay, and is the world okay? Kind of, as somebody looking to do real deep meaningful change, we're always trying to create a space where they feel safe enough to really get into that infant toddler, am I okay, is the world okay? And it's not like they're sucking their thumb in the corner, but they're just kind of in a very young place, and everything they're saying right now is, I'm in a space where I'm very emotional. I need to know it's safe, for example. And it's our job to kind of create that container, as we say in therapy, to where they can have that regression, so to speak, and they can get a different experience. They can feel safe. They can feel supported. They can, as a toddler, they can struggle, and I'll be like, I'll push back when you're pushing too far on me, but we're going to have a little, I'm not going to push you over, and I'm not going to let you push me over, but we can wrestle here in the middle.
Yeah.
Um, and so to a certain extent, I don't think of the circuits so specifically, but I'm just always watching those states. I guess I am. I just, at this point, after 15 years of experience, I just kind of roll with it and it just
Yeah.
happens on its own. But the transpersonal stuff, again, if I was doing psychedelic therapy or if I was talking with somebody that had a psychedelic experience or is having some kind of spiritual emergency,
Hmm.
I could bring that in. That's not really the work I do.
Yeah.
But it's also just, you understand when people go through shock that they're getting some kind of, maybe they're getting re-imprinted or maybe they're just being opened up to
Hmm.
something and exposing some old things, or but at that shock is kind of that transpersonal thing, and you just have to respect that, oh, that's why they're
Hmm.
kind of in this place.
So it sounds like what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, that it isn't so much that you have like an 8 circuit system for working with your clients, as much as, would you say that the 8 circuit model informs your
Yeah,
practice to an extent, and has it been helpful?
I mean, in the bigger picture, it's helpful for me to make sense of the world. Like
Yeah.
if you look at therapy and it's like, well, there's evidence based and that's cognitive therapy, and it's the gold standard. But then there's this psychodynamic therapy, which is about being in a relationship and how
Yeah.
to, and they argue that they're the better, and I would agree. But what's the difference and why this and why that? And it's like, oh, well, cognitive behavioral therapy is just third circuit therapy, and
Hmm.
it's gonna, you can open up to new belief systems, but maybe it's not getting into the deeper work or the first and second circuit. But I can hang that piece on this part of the skeleton. And when I start talking about attachment therapy, oh, well, that's, the first and maybe the second. And okay, so that's where the deeper work can get done. And I'm trying to think of some others off the top of my head, but it helped me make sense of the world. It gives me a framework to understand the human condition and understand, what parts are talking at what part of time. And I guess when I say I don't really use it so much, it's really that I've just internalized it,
Right. Right.
and it just kind of goes, and I've internalized it in a way where, like, some of my fellow practitioners with the same training, they have their Dewey model of, is the world okay? Am I okay? And so they've internalized it in the same way, but maybe they don't have the same bigger picture of, this is how
Right.
therapy and psychology could all fit together in one model, so to speak.
Sure. And we'll kind of wrap up a little bit, but I'm just
Okay.
wondering at what point kind of on your intellectual journey you discovered this stuff, and
Yeah,
what larger impact it had on you.
it was probably the late 90s when I started getting into Wilson. I was at that deoxy.org website that
Hmm.
I talk about a lot, and it had a
I remember
lot of
that.
eight circuit pages, and I remember just devouring that. And I had also had read John Lilly, and he had compared it to Lilly's system, and and then there was
Mhm.
Gurdjieff was another one that had his own system. It's very similar to Lilly's, I think, and so those isomorphisms got me excited, and just the whole thing really resonated with me at that time. And then it was, I guess, not quite 10 years later when I went into grad school for psychology, psychotherapy, and I
Mhm.
just kind of held that in the back of my mind as that skeleton, so to speak, because nobody was talking about it.
Yeah.
So, um, but when we studied all these things, it just gave me a framework to work with. It made sense of the big picture, like, oh, this is where all these pieces fit together.
Yeah. It's such an interesting idea that, like, this, you know, framework for understanding psychology, consciousness, evolution, even, like, was kind of hashed out while Leary was in disrepute in jail, was picked up by a bunch of like stoners essentially, or or
Yeah,
people on the fringe, and it's kind of working its way into science, but not, it's not like, it's never been adopted by the academy. It's kind of interesting to watch it kind of bubbling under the surface.
it's a it's a meta model. I think that and it's hard to like scientifically prove it or disprove it in a
Right.
way. And but
For
I think
instance, if Leary had a different concept of circuit of imprinting, of activating a circuit, and we decided something different, is it still the 8 circuit model? Is it still Leary's model?
yeah,
Which,
right.
which you know you can make the case, well, it's evolving and changing, but yeah, like you said, it's a meta model, it's a framework, it's a metaphor for understanding these things.
I think what their heresy was, their genius or Leary's, was
Mhm.
that to use my words, we have an infant imprint that is back there running, and number one, it's still back there running. Like that's a part of us. This first circuit is not something we just grew out of. It's back there running, part of our
Yeah,
consciousness and how we show up. And two, that it can be changed. Um, yeah, and of course, I think the biggest one is that could be changed.
yeah,
At that time, that was complete heresy. And then things like neuroplasticity and neuroregeneration started becoming accepted ideas, and I think it really goes back to epigenetic imprinting,
yeah, yeah,
which Leary talked about in Game of Life. He mentions epigenetics. He refers to histones. It's like a
yeah.
brief little quote of like two
Hmm.
sentences. And it's like, how did you even know about this in the 80s?
Yeah.
It's things like that that get me. I really am no fan of the correspondence, the Game of Life. All that correspondence thing, I think, is just mental masturbation, to be
Uh-huh.
frank. But you read that little piece in there, and I read that nugget on histones. I'm like, that's epigenetics.
Hmm.
He wrote this in the 80s. How did? And that was Leary.
Yeah, yeah. uh well, Mike, this has been awesome.
Yeah.
You and I really appreciate all your work. I've kind of did a little bit of a deep dive.
Okay.
Yeah, I talked to Ross. He said that you have an interview with Wayne Benner coming out.
Yeah, that was a little weird, and that Wayne didn't want to be on a podcast. He had been talking to Rasa about Terra 2 and just the
Uh-huh.
publishing rights. And he said he had some ideas that he wanted to get out in the world
Yeah,
before he moved on in life or died.
yeah.
And he wanted a writer to help flesh him out. And I
Mhm.
was like, well, I'll take a crack at it. And he says, why don't you just interview him and record it and see how it goes? And so I tried to stick to his ideas. He was just kind of repeating like the automation, rich economy stuff, and it didn't seem well thought out or anything. But he kept going on tangents and telling
Yeah.
stories. So I got a lot of the first time I was trying to keep him on track, and then I called him again, and I just let him tell stories, and it was kind of a mess, but Ross has been editing it, so hopefully
Uh-huh.
it'll make a good episode. I think there's
Interesting.
quite a few little stories in there about Leary in prison.
Yeah, the one question I always had from reading these biographies and reading, flashbacks and stuff is when they talk about this transmission, this Terra 2, the starseed signals, what are they talking about? Are they talking about
Right.
like Wayne and Tim and their Joanna and Sigrid or whatever his name is, like holding hands and lighting candles? Or are they talking about something more prosaic? And it just, as a journalist, I get caught on these like little details that nobody seems to care about. So I've been having this weird like conversation where I like email questions to Rasa and he texts them to Wayne, and then Wayne does voice to text, and I get this weird like psychedelic thing with no punctuation back. And it's actually been quite helpful, but he answered my question, so that will be
Yeah.
revealed in my book.
Right. Oh, cool.
And basically they were just having conversations about science fiction topics, and Tim was like, two prisoners shouldn't be having this conversation. This is probably a transmission from higher intelligence,
Huh.
which Wayne
Are
loved,
you?
because he wanted to be, I think psychologically, he wanted to be a guy who picks up transmissions from higher intelligence. So of
Interesting. I lost my train of thought there, but
course, you read like interviews with Leary at the time, and even later after he got out of prison when he was still with Joanna, and he's always using the royal we, I guess, out of habit, because he always, when he was with Rosemary, things were written by him and Rosemary. And then
Mm.
like when he was with Joanna, he saw something about the male female polarity being,
Yeah, yeah.
so
Well, that I guess what I was going to say. Yeah, now I remember. Are you familiar with Eric Davis's high weirdness?
yeah,
So it's like the starseed transmissions are going on in that same like early to middle 670s time period where it almost like fits in with the
yeah,
the other three guys and their experiences. But I haven't studied this in depth, but it was never clear to me,
yeah.
what was going on, if it was, yeah.
Well, I have the freebie Zoom, so we're gonna run out of time in a minute.
Okay.
But this has been fascinating, and I hope I get to talk to you again at some point
I'd be happy
in the
to. When
future.
you mentioned Leary's intellectual history, there's all kinds of. Well, anyway, I'd be happy to chat with you more. Leary and the Eighth Circuit model are interesting topics to me.
Uh-huh.
I did. I don't know. There was a second long PDF I wrote about like two's company, three's a Fenord, that the
Yeah,
link
I
was
got that.
broken for. Okay, the link was broken for a while, and then I've done some short videos on YouTube that
Okay.
were kind of rough, but you can find those on my YouTube channel. You
I
might
will
find some nuggets in there.
I'll check that out.
And I'd be happy to chat. Enjoyed this.
Thank you. Me too. And I'll be in touch.
All right. Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye.